Kenton and Campbell, the three northernmost counties of Kentucky, are defined by the twisting course of the mighty Ohio River. They seem much like countless other places scattered across the landscape of America. A mix of medium-sized cities, small river towns, sprawling suburbs, and historic farming communities. Northern Kentucky has long been defined by its relationship to the city of Cincinnati, just across the Ohio. And yet, in its history, Northern Kentucky has been home to untold generations of Native Americans and a destination for thousands of European immigrants. It is here that an internationally renowned scientific treasure was discovered, and here that one of the most infamous illegal gambling centers in America thrived. Northern Kentucky has in its history been dismissed as a fly on the coach wheel of Cincinnati, and has been widely studied as an example of innovative urban development. Yes, Northern Kentucky is a place like many others, and yet there really is no other place quite like it. This place at the far western reaches of America's first frontier. This place at the northernmost edge of the American South. This place at the crossroads of a nation. This place where the river bends.
Major funding for Where the River Bends, A History of Northern Kentucky was provided by Eva and Oakley Ferris, supporting historic preservation, the arts, and education in Northern Kentucky, educating people to give them the tools to live better lives. And by the Scripps Howard Foundation and the Kentucky Post, helping to build healthy communities through the support of sound educational programs, arts and culture, family involvement, social services, and civic affairs. And by St. Elizabeth Medical Center. Founded in 1861, St. Elizabeth staff and physicians continue to carry out the mission of healing today by providing nationally recognized health care to the people of Northern Kentucky and Greater Cincinnati. Additional funding was provided by Citigroup, Fifth Third Bank, and by Toyota Motor Engineering and Manufacturing North America.
From our limited human perspective, rivers are eternal. They rise or they fall through the vagaries of nature, flowing along their inexorable course to the sea, mindless of the fleeting events played out along their shores. The river we call the Ohio, which defines northern Kentucky, has followed its current course far longer than any humans have inhabited this land. But in geological terms, the Ohio is a young river, parts of it perhaps only 100,000 years old, much younger than the Licking River, which flows through the heart of northern Kentucky. An ancient version of the Licking and the Kentucky River to the west once emptied into the long-vanished Taze River, much further to the north. That was before a series of climate changes known as the Ice Ages destroyed the Taze and created the Ohio. That early, deep-stage Ohio River would in turn be altered by the advance and retreat of the great glaciers.
Prior to about 100,000 years ago, the Ohio River flowed north of where it does today, and it was referred to as the deep stage Ohio. When the Wisconsin Glacier came here after 100,000 years ago, it moved or shifted that further down to the south. So this little strip that's right in front of downtown Cincinnati and a little bit on either side is a little less than 100,000 years old. If that hadn't have happened, where we're sitting today in downtown Cincinnati would have been in northern Kentucky.
And so the geography and ultimately the destiny of this region was shaped by the shifting landscape, a process that continued as the last glacier retreated northward. Ice Age animals were attracted to the abundant food supply found along the southern edge of the glacier. And at places like Big Bone Lick, there was also something else those animals found irresistible.
Big Bone Lick, Kentucky was an environmental magnet. It's a place where salt water rises to the surface along with sulfur, both needed for large herd animals. During the Ice Age, it attracted the likes of woolly mammoths, the Columbian mammoths, ground sloths that were the size of trees, beavers that were the size of bears, what we call mega mammals.
The salt-laden ground at Big Bone Lick not only attracted these giant animals, sometimes it kept them there, trapping them in the swampy, unstable terrain. These herds congregating at the salt springs also attracted the only predator capable of bringing down these enormous mega mammals. There is no written record and little physical evidence remaining of the earliest people of what is now northern Kentucky, people that today we call Paleo-Indians.
Northern Kentucky was occupied for at least 12 to perhaps 14,000 years, and we find artifacts from the very end of the Ice Ages, the so-called Paleo-Indian time period, when people would have been coexisting with animals that no longer exist here, and with animals that have gone extinct since then.
As the last of the glaciers receded, it brought an end to the age of the mega mammals and of the Paleo-Indian society built around the hunting of these giant beasts.
As the weather warmed up, the Native Americans had to change how they lived. They couldn't hunt the large animals anymore because they went north with the cold weather, or many of them became extinct. So in hunting smaller animals, their lifestyle changed. We called those Native Americans archaic Indians. In that time period, they settled down. They started growing plants like squash and sunflowers, and we have evidence of that archaeologically. They began to live in small villages along the streams and the rivers. And by about 2,500 years ago, we start calling them the woodland Indians. And the difference from archaic to woodland is really arbitrary, but at that time, around here, we start seeing pottery.
Most of what we know of the woodland culture is based on tiny remnants, fragments of bone, shards of pottery, or a small piece of worked stone. But the woodland Indians also created something truly monumental.
They also start building mounds in which they buried their dead.
There's a great degree of misinterpretation about mounds in northern Kentucky. Actually, mounds or heaps of earth can result for several reasons. Most of what has been excavated and lost in this area were sacred areas, areas that were places where the dead were interred into the ground, and also ceremonial areas.
The mound-building woodland culture, which in this region included the Hopewell and the Adena, continued for about 1,000 years. Then, another cultural shift took place.
About 500 AD, the Hopewell culture, I don't want to say stops, but it changes. People aren't building the large earthworks and burial mounds anymore, but they do start living in large villages. And they shift to the rivers. And part of that is because corn is coming into play as a major crop. So that by about 1200 AD, they're living on corn. It's a major part of their diet.
These village dwellers, known as the Fort Ancient people, lived in northern Kentucky well into the 1600s. Then, other groups arrived and began to claim the region. The French were the first Europeans to arrive. The explorer Sieur de La Salle passed through in 1669, and it was a French military expedition some 70 years later that literally put one northern Kentucky place on the map. Headed by Captain Charles Lemonnier de Longueuil, the expedition, including 20 Shawnee guides, came down the Ohio River in 1739, arriving at a place known today as Split Rock. From Split Rock, the expedition followed a bison trail leading to salt springs along a small creek. There, they came across something astonishing.
Longueuil noticed that there were large bones surrounding the salt springs. He also realized that they looked like the bones of elephants. And having been in this country long enough, knowing there were no elephants around, he asked his Shawnee guides, where'd these large bones come from? The Shawnee guide said, our ancestors hunted these animals, the old ones.
A map made during the expedition described this as the place where the bones of many elephants were found. It was the first documented expedition to Big Bone Lick. Despite these earlier expeditions, the person traditionally held to be the first European in what is now northern Kentucky was an explorer and surveyor by the name of Christopher Gist. Hired by a group of Virginians interested in developing the region, Gist surveyed the land along a 600-mile stretch of the Ohio River, from its headwaters to the falls of the Ohio. In the spring of 1751, Christopher Gist reached the point on the west bank of the Licking River where it flows into the Ohio. While here, he met a British Indian trader who showed Gist bones that had been collected from nearby Big Bone Lick.
He assured me that the rib bones of the largest of these beasts were 11 feet long and the skull bone 6 feet wide. The tooth which I brought in for the Ohio Company was a jaw tooth of better weight than 4 pounds.
There is one other notable explorer of northern Kentucky from this era, but unlike the others, this person never planned to set out on an adventure. Her name was Mary Draper Ingalls, and her story was set in motion when in 1754, after years of hostilities, war broke out between French and British forces in America. She was living on the far western reaches of the American colonies, at a settlement called Draper's Meadow, Virginia.
The Shawnee Indians at that time were allied with the French against the English, and they also were a little bit peevish by then because they had been pushed out of their different territories. So they were living in the Ohio Valley by that time, and Mary Ingalls' group of settlers there in the valley were English people.
In the summer of 1755, 23-year-old Mary Ingalls was tending her garden and watching her 2 young sons when a party of Shawnee warriors appeared. The warriors attacked, killing 4 settlers. Mary, her sons, and several other survivors were taken captive and led away to the north along the banks of the New River.
They took her and a few other people, took them down the Kanawha River, down the Ohio to the Scioto.
Eventually, Mary Ingalls was separated from her sons and was taken to the Shawnee village of Chillicothe.
They kept them there for a while, and then they took Mary Ingalls down to Big Bone Lick on a salt-making expedition.
At Big Bone Lick, Mary Ingalls was once again on the south side of the Ohio. By then it was October, and seeing this as her only chance to escape, she convinced another captive to join her, a woman known only as the Old Dutch Woman. They had only the dresses in which they had been captured. They were without weapons or provisions, map or guide. Neither woman could swim, but Mary Ingalls knew that if she could retrace her path along the rivers, she could somehow find her way home. 6 weeks later, on the western slopes of the Allegheny Mountains, a Virginia settler spotted what looked to be a dead animal in a field of corn stubble. Incredibly, what he had really found was Mary Draper Ingalls, near death from starvation and exposure. After a journey of more than 500 miles, Mary Draper Ingalls had come within 30 miles of making it all the way home. Mary Draper Ingalls and the old Dutchwoman were the first European women known to set foot in northern Kentucky. But ultimately, it was Mary Ingalls' long journey home that remains one of the most amazing and inspirational stories of survival in all of American history. The Ohio River might seem the easiest route to America's western frontier, but as the story of Mary Ingalls dramatically showed, the native people would not readily give way to the oncoming wave of white settlers. By 1776, only about 200 adventurous souls had settled in Kentucky. Almost all had come not down the Ohio, but through the Cumberland Gap. Almost none made it as far as northern Kentucky, choosing to settle in and around forts in central Kentucky at Harrodsburg, Boonesboro, and Logan Station. That same year, tensions between the British Crown and the American colonies reached the breaking point. Beyond the mountains and along the western frontier, Kentucky was far from the primary battlefronts of the American Revolution. By the summer of 1782, it had been nearly a year since General Washington's victory at Yorktown, and fighting had for the most part ended. But there was still a battle left to be fought, and it would be fought in Kentucky. In August 1782, a force of 500 British troops and Native Americans attacked the fort at Bryan Station and then retreated northward. 180 Kentucky militiamen gave chase. What the Kentucky militia didn't realize was that they were only pursuing half the force. Another 500 men were lying in wait at Blue Licks, a salt spring along the Licking River. On the morning of August 19, 1782, the Kentucky militia charged. In a short and bloody battle, the Kentuckians were quickly overwhelmed. 72 Kentuckians died that day. Following the defeated Blue Licks, famed General George Rogers Clark gathered a force of more than 1,000 men at the point where the Licking meets the Ohio.
This was a convenient mustering point for George Rogers Clark and his militia to curtail once and for all the Indian menace on Kentucky settlers. And the troops were meeting here at the present foot of Greenup Street here in Covington to muster together to march northward and raid the Indian villages.
Crossing the river, Clark's forces destroyed 5 native villages along the Little Miami River. It's been said the Battle of Blue Licks was the last significant battle of the Revolutionary War. It also carried another significance as the last Native American raid into Kentucky. Native war parties would never again fight a full-fledged battle here. For a few more years, perhaps as a warning, there would be an occasional attack on a boat traveling down the Ohio, but it was only a gesture. Having lived and hunted, fought and died here for well over 12,000 years, the sun had finally set on the Native Americans in this land where the river bends. With the threat of Indian attack all but gone and America's freedom gained, the way was cleared for settlement along the western frontier. It was all the encouragement the citizens of this new nation needed. And one of the first areas to be settled was the Ohio River Valley, known at the time as the Western Waters. In 1788, a group of speculators established a settlement on the north bank of the Ohio between the Great and Little Miami Rivers. John Filson drew a plan for the new settlement, naming it Losantaville, using bits from 4 different languages to say city opposite the mouth of the Licking. Growth and change came quickly for Losantiville. Just 2 years after its founding, the governor of the Northwest Territory renamed the settlement Cincinnati, and the federal government constructed Fort Washington there, named in honor of the nation's newly elected president. While Cincinnati was taking hold on the north bank, settlements were also springing up south of the river. Tanner's Station, established by John Tanner, a Baptist preacher from North Carolina, was the first formal settlement in northern Kentucky.
Northern Kentucky was settled due in large part because of the Ohio River, that great avenue of transportation. And a lot of the folks that first came and settled into this area came by way of flatboat and would come down, and we had a couple of different stations that were here, one at Leach's Station on the Licking River and one Tanner Station that was along the Ohio River around in Petersburg.
During this era, several men played crucial roles in the development of northern Kentucky. One of the first was Major David Leach, a Revolutionary War veteran who decided to seek his fortune in the West. Leach purchased, sight unseen, thousands of acres along the Licking River, where he established a settlement that would one day become the community of Wilder. 2 years later, David Leach traveled to Bryan Station near Lexington, Kentucky. While there, he met and married 17-year-old Keturah Moss. The couple returned to Leach's Station, where David built a home for his young bride. In the spring of 1793, another man, a 24-year-old Virginian who would leave his indelible mark on the region, made his way to northern Kentucky.
James Taylor came to Newport to settle in 1793, a couple years after his brother Hubbard Taylor had come through and laid out the town of Newport on behalf of their father.
It was Hubbard Taylor who gave Newport its name, honoring the British sea captain Christopher Newport, who in 1606 brought the first settlers to Jamestown, Virginia, the earliest permanent English settlement in America.
I suppose many people in the days of the late 1700s would have regarded people like James Taylor as absolutely crazy. They were educated, refined people from Virginia, of good families, and to come out and be kind of pioneers in an area of wilderness would have seemed peculiar to many people. They weren't the kinds of pioneers with coonskin hats. They were educated and refined. So even James Taylor's 2 slaves that he brought with him, Moses and Humphreys, thought he was absolutely crazy for coming to Newport. They said to him, "There are no women to wash our clothes. There's no one to talk to, especially on Sundays, which were days of visiting." And they said, "Why don't you please move where your brother Hubbard has moved, to Lexington? This is a city that has everything." And he said no, because he was an entrepreneur and he really wanted to build up his father's 1,500 acres.
In the fall of 1794, David Leach died from pneumonia, leaving his entire estate to his wife, Keturah. The next year, James Taylor and Keturah Moss Leach were wed, a union that joined the 2 largest landowners in northern Kentucky. Unlike Newport, the land on the west bank of the Licking, the area known as the Point, changed hands several times before being purchased by Thomas Kennedy, who arrived by flatboat from Pennsylvania in 1792. For the next quarter century, Kennedy and his family lived there, farming, running a tavern, operating a ferry. Early records called this place Kennedy's Ferry, or sometimes West Newport. The same year Thomas Kennedy arrived, Kentucky became the 15th state of the Union and the first west of the Allegheny Mountains. In 1795, northern Kentucky, which had been divided among several counties, was joined into a single county, Campbell, in honor of Colonel John Campbell, a Revolutionary War officer and Kentucky pioneer. 3 years later, Campbell County was itself divided, with the new county being named for Daniel Boone.
Campbell was a pretty big county initially. Boone County came out of it. There was more a good farmland, really, in Boone County than either Kenton or Campbell, so we became a strong farming community. with no major cities like Covington, Newport, or any of those.
In 1798, in northern Kentucky's only established city, James Taylor donated the land for the first public school in the region, the Newport Academy.
The Academy of Newport will commence on the 1st of April, in which will be taught reading, writing, and arithmetic at $8 per annum. Also, the English.
It wasn't long before James Taylor saw another opportunity. Using family and business connections, Taylor was able to move the arsenal from Fort Washington in Cincinnati to 5 acres at the confluence of the Licking and Ohio, land which he donated.
These people would use their friendships and their relatives to help forward their cause. For instance, James Taylor in 1803 was awarded the Newport Barracks, which was the major Army headquarters in the West, what was then called the West, or what we call the Midwest. And he probably achieved that because his first cousin, once removed, was James Madison, who was Secretary of State under President Thomas Jefferson. So it helped to have good connections and also kind of an entrepreneurial spirit.
It was this entrepreneurial spirit that would earn James Taylor a fortune and set in motion the economic engine of northern Kentucky. As the worries of the Revolutionary War faded, the people of the new nation found time to entertain other interests. Many became fascinated with the gigantic bones being discovered at several sites throughout the country. The most famous of these was Big Bone Lick.
This was one of the very first places where people were finding Ice Age animals in North America, and it became a very famous place. People like Thomas Jefferson and Ben Franklin were fascinated by what they could learn from it. Europeans like the French anatomist Cuvier, the English, British geologist Charles Lyell, were very intrigued by what was being found at Big Bone Lick.
Charles Willson Peale, America's most famous artist of the time, was inspired by the giant bones to open a museum in Philadelphia, where he charged visitors an extra 50 cents to view a reconstructed mastodon skeleton, what he called a mammoth. Soon, the nation found itself in the throes of mammoth mania. And no one was more enthralled than the President of the United States. In 1803, President Thomas Jefferson sent his secretary, Meriwether Lewis, to meet up with William Clark near the frontier town of Louisville for an expedition to explore the territory far to the west. But first, Jefferson instructed Lewis to stop at the famous Big Bone Lick.
We charged Lewis to stop there, and Lewis stopped in Cincinnati and gathered up one of the foremost naturalists of the West, a fellow by the name of Dr. William Goforth, and he and Goforth went out to the site.
He looked at the collection that Goforth had assembled from Big Bone Lick to make sure if they captured the creature or killed one, they had the right animal whose remains were found at Big Bone Lick, Kentucky.
The president thought it was possible the giant creatures were not extinct and hoped the expedition would find living specimens.
At the end of the Lewis and Clark expedition, it became evident that these animals were indeed extinct. Given that, Jefferson, out of his own pocket, financed an expedition immediately following the Lewis and Clark expedition. And he sent George Rogers Clark and his brother William Clark to excavate at Big Bone Lick.
More than 300 specimens from Big Bone Lick were crated and sent to President Jefferson in Washington. He set them up in what he called the Bone Room, which would later be known as the East Room of the White House.
The bones that were in the White House that came from Big Bone Lick, approximately a third of them went to the American Philosophical Society. Jefferson kept, probably about 20% of them. The rest were sent to France to their Association for Natural History. The bones can still be found in France. They are labeled under the Jefferson Collection.
His political enemies had a field day, ridiculing the president's fascination with fossils.
He was called Mr. Mammoth because of that. He was ridiculed And even in newspapers, it would be printed that he had more important things that he should be focusing on rather than animals that didn't exist anymore.
History would treat Thomas Jefferson more kindly, and some would call him the father of paleontology for his work in what was then a new branch of science. As for Big Bone Lick, where the giants once roamed, with most of its fossils scattered into collections throughout the world, Big Bone Lick would be largely forgotten for more than a century. With the channel of the Ohio near the northern shore, Cincinnati was already a prime destination for pioneers. Northern Kentucky, by comparison, was encircled by steep hills and divided by the Licking River, which continually deposited silt where it emptied into the Ohio. Still, northern Kentucky continued to develop, mostly along the Licking River, especially near the Newport Barracks.
Newport Barracks is extremely important in the history of northern Kentucky because if it had not been for that military fort, I don't think people would have settled there as quickly as they did. And if they hadn't settled there as quickly as they did, Campbell County would not have developed as quick as it did.
The barracks is an economic boon to the region, but it does have a few small problems.
It was never a very desirable place for a soldier to be stationed because there was very little flood control on the river during those times. I'm sure that it smelled of mold, and it was not a very nice place to be billeted.
Newport Barracks attracted many cottage industries to support the military men, including certain less than desirable enterprises.
You have to remember, Kentucky was the first state of the West. This was America's toehold in the western frontier. And so with that came a rough, loose frontier way of life, a military life which was accustomed to drinking and carousing when you weren't fighting. You had to enjoy life in the fullest. So gambling and camp followers soon gathered down there at the Newport Barracks.
Other industries and towns also developed. John Grant, a nephew of Daniel Boone, established a salt-making venture along Phillips Creek, about 20 miles south of Newport. The community of Grant's Lick would grow up around the salt works. Frank Spillman began selling lots in 1819 for what would become Alexandria. Craig's Camp, which would later be renamed Burlington, was laid out. A saw and grist mill were built that were bought by and later named for James Taylor. The early Boone County village of Tanner's Station became Caledonia, and then in 1818 was renamed Petersburg. In many communities, the first public structure was a church. Among the earliest in the region were the Bulletsburg Baptist Church at North Bend Bottoms, founded in 1794, Wolper Creek Baptist Church, established in 1801, and the Hopeful Lutheran Church, founded in 1806 by a group of Germans from Virginia. In 1811, the first steamboat to go down the Ohio River sailed past northern Kentucky. Unlike the earlier flatboats and canoes, steamboats could maneuver both up and down the river with ease, redefining transportation and commerce in the region.
The improvements in transportation can hardly be exaggerated as far as their importance for transforming the lives of ordinary people are concerned. The sudden arrival of products which had been too expensive to bring into this area before, plus the sudden ability to ship products out at a cheaper cost, meant that farmers who had been more or less producing for their own subsistence now realized that it made more sense to specialize in certain crops which they could sell for a high profit and use the profits to buy products that they couldn't as efficiently produce for themselves. So it's ways like that that everybody, whether they be farmers or manufacturers or consumers, had their lives changed by the cheapening of costs that modern transportation created.
For sale or rent, the farm and ferries at the mouth of the Licking, opposite Cincinnati. A description is unnecessary, as
At age 70, Thomas Kennedy decided to sell his ferry business at the point of the Licking, and in 1814 he sold 150 of his 200 acres to Thomas Carneal and two brothers, John and Richard Gano. The men laid out a new town, naming it for General Leonard Covington, a hero of the War of 1812.
Covington was established in 1815, and at the time, the Gano brothers established 5 streets, north and south, and they were laid out to identically line up with the north-south streets in Cincinnati. The first 5 streets are named after the first 5 governors of Kentucky: Shelby, Scott, Garrett, Greenup, and Madison.
This was a time when, with a few dollars and a lot of big dreams, a new city could spring up almost overnight. Covington was about to join Newport, Cincinnati, Louisville, and a host of other young frontier towns along the western waters, competing to become America's next great city. Northern Kentucky was a region that captured the eye of many visionaries, people who saw the region's rolling terrain as a blank canvas on which to create an image of the future. One such vision was first delineated in 1818 when Thomas Carneal built a magnificent new home called Elmwood Hall on a hillside overlooking the Ohio River west of Covington.
It was one of the most gracious homes of North America and is still standing. And in 1827, an Englishman by the name of William Bullock was coming up the river on his travels to America. He fell in love with the home, said that from the time he left on his travels from Great Britain to the United States, and he had worked his way up through Mexico, he had never seen a more gracious home. So he buys in 1827 all 968 acres.
William Bullock was a consummate showman. He had made a fortune in England with his Museum of Curiosities, known as the Egyptian Hall. But Bullock had even bigger plans for this small piece of northern Kentucky.
He has this vision to turn it into a little picturesque, rural, self-sufficient town called Hygeia, literally meaning health in Greek. He goes back to England, and he has John Papworth, one of the leading architects and landscape architects of the day, design a city with beautiful radial boulevards, parks, library, museum, and he was going to have all different levels, economic levels of society live there as kind of a village away from the dirt, the grime, and the corruption of the city.
Despite his considerable skills as a salesman, William Bullock wasn't able to sell the idea of Hygeia. Finally, in 1830, he sold the property to Israel Ludlow, and the town that did develop was laid out and named for him. But in one respect, William Bullock's dream was realized. Ludlow attracted a number of Cincinnatians seeking to escape the pollution and congestion of the city. One of the most notable Ludlow residents was A.B. Latta, inventor of the steam-powered fire engine. Latta sold his invention to the city of Cincinnati in 1852. The following year, Cincinnati became the first city in America to have a full-time paid fire department and the first in the world to use the Latta steam engine. While Ludlow established itself as a suburban community, Covington and Newport continued to strive toward more ambitious goals.
The urban historian Richard Wade talks a lot about an urban sweepstakes. That is, cities like Covington and Cincinnati and Newport and Louisville and St. Louis, all wanting to be the most prosperous, the most populous cities in the Midwest. And Cincinnati certainly had the edge in terms of geography. The better harbor facilities, when steamboats came along, were in Cincinnati. Covington and Newport, on the other hand, were divided. They were bisected by the Licking River, which led to that feeling of separation and even of rivalry between Covington and Newport.
By 1830, Cincinnati the first boom town of the West, had taken the lead in the region's urban sweepstakes. Its population had swelled to 25,000, making it one of the country's largest cities. Covington and Newport had a combined population of just 1,500. And more, their competitive spirits looked across the Licking River toward each other. Their rivalry would only increase when in 1840, with urging from prominent Covingtonians, the state legislature split Campbell County at the Licking, creating a new county named for Kentucky pioneer Simon Kenton. State law required the county seat be near the geographical center of the county. In 1842, Independence, named to celebrate the split from Campbell County, was incorporated and became the Kenton County seat. Meanwhile, across the Licking, the county seat of Campbell County was moved to Alexandria. This didn't sit well with the folks in Newport and Covington, who bristled at having lost out politically, so both cities promptly established their very own courthouses. As a result, Kenton and Campbell would become the only two counties in Kentucky to have two county seats. With the revolutionary new means of transportation, first steamboats and within a few years the railroads, this region was perfectly situated for development. This was the era when Cincinnati became the nation's meatpacking center, its many slaughterhouses earning it the nickname Porkopolis. But not all the slaughterhouses were north of the river.
Covington had a huge pork packing establishment called Millward and Oldershaw, one of the nation's largest. It was located around 12th Street on the Licking River in Covington. And this particular slaughterhouse and pork packing establishment prepared pork for the English market. So it would be taken all the way down the Licking River, the Ohio River, the Mississippi River to New Orleans, and then shipped across the Atlantic to England.
Other industries were also developing in northern Kentucky. One of the largest, begun by James Taylor in 1831, was a 27-acre factory district along the Ohio River called the Newport Manufacturing Company. The district eventually included a sawmill, cotton mill, hemp factory, and clothing makers. Business was booming across the Licking as well. In 1834, Covington had a population of 1,500 and boasted 2 cotton factories, 5 tobacco and cigar factories, 2 distilleries, and a brewery. Northern Kentucky was no longer the frontier. Those with an adventurous streak began looking to places further west, places like the Mexican colony of Texas. So when in 1835, Mexican President Antonio de López Santa Anna marched thousands of troops into Texas to quell an independence movement, it was all the incentive some would need to head west.
You had folks from northern Kentucky going into Texas to settle from the very get-go. You have a lot of volunteers saying, well, maybe we should go down and help out our brothers and sisters down there to defend their rights, to defend their freedoms.
Among those who decided to help out the Texans was a northern Kentucky businessman named Sidney Sherman. Sherman organized a regiment of 52 men and supplied them with uniforms and weapons. In December of 1835, on the eve of their departure for Texas, a banquet was held to honor these Newport volunteers. Among the keepsakes presented to them was a silk flag depicting Lady Liberty, painted by a young local artist named James Henry Beard. By the time the Newport volunteers reached Texas, General Santa Anna's troops had overrun a military post called the Alamo, and the general ordered the execution of all the survivors. Then, 2 weeks later, Santa Anna ordered the mass execution of more than 400 captured Texans at the town of Goliad. Sidney Sherman and the Newport volunteers joined up with Texas General Sam Houston's forces as the Texas Army approached a place called San Jacinto. There, on April 21, 1836, the course of the Texas War of Independence and American history changed. General Santa Anna assumed, wrongly, that the Texans would not attack.
Once the charge began, well, actually it wasn't a charge, it was a very slow, quiet advance because they wanted to catch the Mexican army while they were still having their siesta. It was said to have been Sherman who was the first to have cried "Remember the Alamo" after the artillery boomed and the jig was up and the general rout began.
The Battle of San Jacinto lasted only 18 minutes before the Mexicans, having been outmaneuvered, surrendered. Sidney Sherman's rallying cry to his troops that day to "Remember the Alamo" went on to become one of the most famous battle cries in history, perhaps because this one brief battle had far-reaching implications.
No Battle of San Jacinto, no independent Texas. No independent Texas, no annexation of Texas by the United States, which provokes the Mexican War, by which the United States wins Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California, and becomes a continental power, and goes on to become the United States that we know today.
General Sherman's family would later donate the tattered remnants of the flag carried by the Newport Volunteers who came to the aid of Texas. To this day, it occupies a place of honor in the chambers of the State House of Representatives in the Texas Capitol. By 1850, Covington, with nearly 10,000 residents, had surpassed Lexington as Kentucky's second-largest city. Waves of immigrants were pouring into the region. Some were Irish, escaping the devastation of the potato famine in their homeland, but it was the Germans who found this area especially appealing.
The Ohio River reminded Germans of the River Rhine and the Rhine River Valley, and they looked at it and saw this beautiful river valley. They saw the luscious landscape, the farmland, and they started writing about it and comparing it to the Rhineland in many published reports and books. And when people read these in the old country, then they were attracted to this area and to the Ohio River Valley.
One of the earliest German communities in northern Kentucky was at Camp Springs.
Camp Springs in Campbell County was a very interesting community made up of German Catholic immigrants who formed their own institutions in that area, like St. Joseph Church, and even built their houses in a particular way, these stone houses that showed exactly where they were from.
The heritage of the residents of Camp Springs was also evident in the vineyards that spread across the hillsides. They grew grapes and made wine much as they had done back in Germany. By the mid-19th century, this region of the country made 1/3 of all the wine produced in America.
And this song of the vine, this greeting of mine, the winds and the birds shall deliver to the Queen of the West, in her garlands dressed, on the banks of the beautiful river.
By the 1840s, the city leaders of Cincinnati knew that for the Queen of the West to continue to thrive, faster, more reliable access to markets in the South would be crucial. Many ferries crisscrossed between northern Kentucky and Cincinnati, but they operated only during daylight and were regularly shut down by high water. A bridge across the Ohio River may have seemed the obvious solution, but not everybody thought a bridge was a great idea.
There were some people who were opposed to building that bridge. There were business people, primarily in Cincinnati, that didn't want to see the bridge built because they thought that would cause competition and would threaten their businesses if you could go over across the river to Covington.
There had been talk of a bridge since at least 1815, but it wasn't until 1846 that the talk finally became a plan. And it was a group of northern Kentuckians, led by Covington businessman Henry Bruce, who came up with that plan. The group considered several designs before hiring a surveyor-turned-bridge builder named John Roebling. A German immigrant living in Pennsylvania, Roebling had just finished a bridge at Pittsburgh that used a new type of wire rope, strands of wire twisted to form a strong cable. He proposed a similar design for Covington. Many obstacles would need to be cleared before Roebling's bridge could become a reality. Perhaps the most difficult to overcome was fears on both sides of the river that slaves escaping northward along the Underground Railroad would use the bridge in their flight to freedom.
As a nation, we began by declaring that all men are created equal. We now practically read it, all men are created equal, except Negroes. Abraham Lincoln, August 24th, 1855.
Racism was always a national phenomenon. It was never merely a regional phenomenon. And what this meant was that the belief in the superiority of people of European origin was prevalent throughout the United States.
By the 1850s, the issue of slavery that had long divided America was threatening to destroy the nation. Here, where the river bends and north meets south, the issue was ever present in a slave state barely a stone's throw away from the free state of Ohio. In 1850, when Harriet Beecher Stowe and her family moved to Maine after 18 years in Cincinnati, she began to work on a novel. 2 years later, Harriet Beecher Stowe published what was to become one of the most influential books in all of American history, Uncle Tom's Cabin, a tale of an African-American slave and the lives of those around him, both slave and free. Some claimed the character Uncle Tom was based on a slave the author met at the Herndon House in Campbell County. Whatever the inspiration, much of what Harriet Beecher Stowe experienced with slavery, she learned in northern Kentucky. For many Americans, the character of Uncle Tom put a human face on the inhuman institution of slavery. A few years later, another tragic story of slavery would unfold here, this one all too real. Margaret Garner, an enslaved African-American, was the property of Archibald Gaines, a Boone County farmer. She seldom left Maplewood, the Gaines farm, though she did accompany the Gaines family to nearby Richwood Presbyterian Church. Margaret Garner's husband, Robert, was owned by another nearby landowner, James Marshall, so the couple's time together was limited. And, as slaves, their marriage was not legally binding, so they lived always with the fear that they, or one of their 4 children, would be sold and taken away. Perhaps it was that fear that led the Garners, on a bitter January night in one of the coldest winters on record, to flee. Heading northward on the Lexington-Covington Turnpike, it was nearly dawn by the time they reached the Ohio River. A 6-inch deep sheet of ice covered the river, allowing the family to walk across. Once across the river, the Garners made their way to the home of Margaret's cousin, Elijah Kite, on 6th Street in Cincinnati. Her cousin then contacted Levi Coffin, a Quaker working with the Underground Railroad, to help the family.
We often think of the Underground Railroad as an institution that smuggled African Americans out of the South to the North. But in its actual practice, the Underground Railroad smuggled African Americans out of the North to Canada. There are some very good reasons for this. One of which, of course, were the fugitive slave laws that made it unsafe for African Americans to remain in the North.
The fugitive slave laws allowed slave owners to pursue their human property into a free state and use U.S. Marshals to capture runaways. So when Archibald Gaines and James Marshall discovered that their human chattel was missing, that was exactly what they did. Federal marshals surrounded the Kite house and forced their way inside. In the ensuing skirmish, Margaret Garner grabbed a butcher knife. She then slit the throat of her 2-year-old daughter, Mary, and injured her other children. Arrested and charged with murder, Margaret Garner would never stand trial on that charge. A murder trial would have acknowledged Margaret and her daughter, Mary, as human beings and having rights. Instead, Margaret Garner stood trial for violating the Fugitive Slave Act.
The fugitive slave trial focused entirely on property relations and focused also on the legality, the constitutionality of the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act that was part of the Compromise of 1850. And so to me, it was a symbolically important case, a politically important case, a legally important case in terms of its impact on the ways that Americans thought about slavery.
For many, Margaret Garner became a symbol of the desperation of enslaved people, a mother who would take the life of her child rather than see her returned to slavery. But after she was found guilty and she and her family were returned to Archibald Gaines, Margaret Garner, the woman, was all but forgotten. Gaines immediately sent the Garner family to a plantation in Arkansas. Later, she would be sold, and in the fall of 1858, Margaret Garner died of typhoid fever on a plantation in Mississippi. She was buried in an unmarked grave. In 1856, 10 years after John Roebling had presented his design for a bridge across the Ohio, construction finally began. A suspension bridge was built over the Licking River between Newport and Covington in 1853, but it collapsed within 2 weeks. Despite this, Covington businessman Amos Schinkel became a major stockholder in the Covington and Cincinnati Bridge Company and pushed the project forward. Still, a lack of funds and the ever more likely threat of war halted construction on the bridge in 1859. The next year, a bridge between the North and South seemed likely to be set aside for good when a Republican congressman named Abraham Lincoln won the presidency. No favorite son in the state where he was born, Lincoln's opposition to slavery made him extremely unpopular. He came in a distant fourth, receiving less than 1% of the Kentucky votes cast in the election of 1860. With Abraham Lincoln in the White House, the Southern states were certain to secede from the Union. But in Kentucky, the decision was far from decided. Would the state secede or stay loyal to the Union? And how would Northern Kentucky, with strong ties to both the North and South, deal with its divided loyalties?